This program
Welcome to Firing Line. I'm Michael Kinsley of the New Republic magazine. The second biggest loser in Operation Desert Storm, people were saying when the war ended, was the Democratic Party. More recently, you might want to make that the third biggest loser, after Saddam and the Kurds. But the fact remains that the Democrats did not have a good war. A large majority of congressional Democrats voted against the war in January. During the long fall debate, prominent Democrats in and out of Congress left hostages to fortune in the form of quotations, warning about huge American casualties and urging that sanctions be given more time to work. Republicans have many of these on videotape and look forward with glee to staging an appeasement film festival during next year's election campaign. President Bush, with the highest poll rating since poll ratings began, seems beyond challenge, and indeed, no leading Democrat has yet declared an intention to challenge him. When their gloating orgies get really sweaty, the Republicans even imagine recapturing control of Congress, which they have not had since 1954. With his well-known concern for the underdog, Mr. Buckley is devoting this program to advising the Democrats on their dilemma. His guest, Representative Stephen Solarz of New York, is especially well qualified to assist. First, he is a Democrat, elected to Congress in 1974. Secondly, he supported, indeed he co-sponsored, the House resolution authorizing the use of force in the Persian Gulf. Third, he has never disguised his ambition to be Secretary of State, giving him a unique incentive to figure out how to get a Democrat back into the White House. Now, Mr. Buckley, in the 1988 campaign, there was a presidential candidate who talked quite a bit about the need for a new world order based on international law and respect for the United Nations, and his opponent ridiculed him for this. That man was not George Bush. That man was Michael Dukakis. Now, does that reality have any practical implications for the political future, or is that just water over the dam?
I think Governor Dukakis was trying to distract attention from the disintegration of Massachusetts and found it easier to talk about a new world order. But I'm glad that you complimented Congressman Solarz, because I think he deserves it. I also find it charming that since the vindication of his efforts, he has practiced compassion for the benefit of his colleagues. But I guess the question I would begin by putting to you, Ms. Solarz, is this. If you succeed in saying, look, after all, if it hadn't been for a few Democrats, Mr. Bush wouldn't have had his authorization, voters are going to be persuaded that if Mr. Solarz is right, then you have one proposition in a syllogism. That proposition is sometimes Democrats are right. On the other hand, the overwhelming majority of Republicans backed it more or less instinctively. So the second part of the proposition is usually Republicans are right. Therefore, the voter ought to vote Democratic on the grounds that sometimes Democrats are right, or ought to vote Republican on the grounds that usually they're right.
Bill, you neglected one part of the syllogism, which is that sometimes Republicans are wrong, as indeed they were when over half of them, in the week prior to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, after Saddam had already deployed over 100,000 troops along the Kuwaiti border, voted against an effort in the House of Representatives to impose sanctions against Iraq.
Yeah, but the Republicans are traditionally anti-sanction, and this is a position that dates back to learned discourses in the Middle Ages, that sanctions ought not to be visited unless they're conclusive in character. And who was saying they were inconclusive in character but you?
Well,
and you're absolutely right.
I think I appreciate the tribute, but I think your historic assessment of the Republican Party's attitude toward sanctions is not justified by the facts. Republicans, for example, have been entirely comfortable supporting sanctions against Cuba, against Vietnam, against Nicaragua under the Sandinistas, against Panama under Mr. Noriega. So they have supported sanctions in a variety of instances.
Yeah, that's right.
When it came to Iraq, however, most of the Republicans in the House were against sanctions. But there's another aspect to this.
But first of all, before you go on, the sanctions against Cuba are paramilitary in character. We tried to invade them. That didn't work. So we don't go from invading them to loving them. We stop somewhere in between. and we settled on sanctions. God knows they have been inconclusive. They are a mark of petulance, if you like, or if you prefer, they are a mark of distinction, i.e. these people stand out as agents of a hegemonic force that up until quite recently we were convinced we might overrun us.
My only point is that Republicans have generally opposed, for example, sanctions against South Africa, but they were entirely comfortable in supporting sanctions against a variety of communist countries. In fact, as I think about it...
There's not this distinction.
As I think about it, I think Republicans generally tend to support sanctions against communist countries, which I do also, but they tend to oppose sanctions against repressive but non-communist regimes, which I think is a mark of intellectual and political inconsistency.
Let me recite for the 1,500th time on this program Fulbright's illuminating distinction. The United States has no proper quarrel with any country in the world, no matter how odious its policies, so long as it does not seek to impose them on others. So we landed our Marines in the Dominican Republic and paid no attention to Haiti, where people were being tortured to death rather systematically by that awful man, because we viewed the Dominican Republic as a Soviet salient. This is a distinction that has a tremendous pedigree, as witnessed John Quincy Adams, who said the American people are friends of liberty everywhere, but custodians only of their own. So that takes now, if you're here to say that the American people were not aware of Iraq as an incipient threat, the answer is absolutely correct. We were not. I'm not 100% you were, although you probably were, but I wasn't. And certainly we tilted towards Iraq during that 8-year war. Mrs. Glaspie, since you wrote your piece for the New York Times, seems to me to have been a little bit vindicated, hasn't she? You assumed that we were being, that Hussein was being told he had nothing to fear from the United States. Mrs. Glaspie has since said, this is exactly what I told him. The United States is not going to stand still for this. Who do you believe?
Oh, I would very much like to see the actual transcript of our discussion
so would I.
with Saddam Hussein, and one has to wonder why the State Department continues to refuse to release it if, in fact, it would vindicate her version of events.
That's an Aesopian formulation. You mean one has to wonder is, I don't believe him, right?
Oh, I am skeptical. Let me put it that way, because I think it would be in the interests of the administration to release the cable of that conversation if, in fact, it justified the conclusion that her version of events was accurate.
I agree.
In any case...
if I had to guess, I would guess that she did what she told us she did, and that the State Department did not react incandescently enough.
Well, her view, as she presented it to our committee when she testified, Bill, was that she had made it perfectly clear to Saddam Hussein that the United States would resist by force, if necessary, any effort on his part to invade Kuwait.
How could she say that without authority to say it?
Because, according to her, she didn't say it explicitly. She conveyed the impression implicitly by saying that the United States would defend its interests, as if that kind of diplomatic code language was instantly understandable by Saddam.
She didn't say to the extent that the Democrats permit us to do so?
I don't think that was part of her instructions. But the fact is, Bill, that even in the immediate aftermath of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, later that day, the president was asked at the White House by the press if he was contemplating sending in American troops, and his initial response was that that wasn't on the agenda. Now, within 24 or 48 hours, he got his moral and political bearings, and then responded magnificently. And I say that as a Democrat. I think our country was fortunate that we had in the White House at that particular time in the history of our nation of the world.
Somebody probably trained by Ronald Reagan.
A man who understood the dimensions of this challenge. But that does not exculpate the president for the responsibility of his administration in creating an atmosphere and a climate in which Saddam Hussein had every reason to believe that we would, in fact, not resist with force his invasion of Kuwait. In that sense,
Churchill was not responsible for Chamberlain and so on and so forth.
In that sense, Bill, I think we made exactly the same mistake we made 40 years earlier when Dean Acheson and Douglas MacArthur read South Korea outside of the American defense perimeter in Asia, thereby giving Kim Il-sung the impression he could get away with an invasion of South Korea. We did exactly the same thing here. Having made that mistake, the president then recovered his ground and then led the nation into a successful effort to liberate Kuwait.
You know why I only agree with you 85% is that Hussein, on this point, is that Hussein proves to have been so egregiously irrational that it's hard to say that anything that we might have done would actually have stalled him. When he saw that we were massively in place, when we gave him a final opportunity to pull out, he still didn't do it. He risked everything. He's impoverished his country, made it impossible for him ever to be an effective prime a despot again. So that I'm not sure that any fireworks we might have aimed in his direction would have stayed that particular volcanic, irrational force. However, I think you're right that our statecraft was simply not very diligent. But let's move on to the extent to which the Democrats are faced with a problem. Now, you are a loyal establishmentarian Democrat with this interesting highlight, which is that you are willing to defy your party when you are moved to do so by your conscience acting intelligently, and you do so very eloquently and very critically. However, the fact that you stood out has the effect of throwing dark shadows on the people you were attempting to coach. Oh. To the extent that you became so singular as a Democrat trying to persuade the Democrats to do the right thing, it threw a special light, it spotlighted their obstinacy.
I appreciate the unexpected and uncustomary tribute, Phil.
Well, because it's very seldom earned.
You are as sparse with your compliments as you are with the taxpayers' money. But let me say that for better or for worse, I was not alone. There were other prominent Democrats.
Al Gore,
there was Senator Joe Lieberman. In the House, there was Dante Fascell, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Les Aspin, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Bob Torricelli, one of the rising stars in the House from New Jersey, Dave McCurdy, the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, Dan Rostenkowski, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Jamie Whitten, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee. 1/3 of all the Democrats in the House supported this proposition. So we weren't in the majority among the Democrats, but I must say I was not alone.
Steve, your reasoning reminds me of the Irishman in the murder trial who volunteered to come up with 30 people who hadn't seen him kill the lady. I can name the people who are on the right side, but it would not consume too much time. The fact is the overwhelming majority of Democrats were against it. Now, I asked the following question. Oh, yes, you said to suggest the Democrats who opposed the use of force before January 15th were appeasers is ludicrous. Would the Republicans also argue that 2 former chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and 56 former defense secretaries, all of whom advocated that sanctions be given more time, were also appeasers? The answer is no. It wasn't so much a matter of appeasement. It was a lack of critical geopolitical intelligence. And the answer is that this often happens to generals and admirals. Most lost wars are lost as a result of dumb decisions by admirals and generals and chiefs of staff. So it didn't surprise me at all that that gang who, for instance, coalesced around the idea of no first nuclear use, sort of opined in favor of sanctions, and it has nothing to do with loyalty. It has to do with inattention to geopolitical reality. And you made that point extremely well in your article from the Republic, urging them to change their mind, unhappily without success, though you were successful with the critical number of people who came around.
I think it's entirely legitimate, Bill, to question the judgment of those who opposed the resolution authorizing the use of force in the Gulf. But I think it is ludicrous for some Republicans, such as Senator Phil Gramm of Texas, who are to accuse those Democrats who opposed the resolution of representing the party of appeasement. What was involved here was a question of judgment, not of appeasement.
No. Their motives might have been entirely dictated by misjudgment, but they certainly represented the party of appeasement, because the party of appeasement obviously leaned on them to act in the way they wanted them to act.
You can hardly accuse people who argued in favor of a continuation of sanctions of encouraging appeasement. Sanctions are not a form of appeasement. They may be insufficient as a means of achieving the objective.
You changed your formulation. You said, did they represent the forces of appeasement? Look, if I were an appeaser, who would I be for, if not for the people, if not for the Democrats who were voting against allowing Mr. Bush to do what you and I wanted him to do? Now, I might have been differently motivated. Let's say I was a pacifist.
So, if you listened carefully to the debate on the floor of the House of Representatives and of the Senate, it would have been clear that the debate was not over whether to accept or acquiesce in the Iraqi annexation of Kuwait, but how best to undo it.
Try to understand what I say. What motivated them doesn't cease to make them the representatives of, in effect, the pacifist party in America. The pacifist party in America, since they can't get pacifists in their Congress, therefore they lean on people whose strategic misjudgment is quite reliable. And this tends to be those Democrats who are always taking us to war because of defective statecraft. They've been doing that throughout the century. But now you also said, after all, Speaker of the House Tom Foley promised that once the decision was made, both parties would unite around it. In fact, virtually every Democrat supported the war after hostilities began. That's true. So did virtually every American. The minute the war began, the polls showed about 92% support. Am I right, Michael? Or 85%, something like that. There's a sense in which Democrats who were elected to office have some ear out.
I've mentioned that simply to refute the suggestion, which some Republicans had made, that the Democrats were in effect unpatriotic by virtue of their opposition to the use of force before January 16th. I think this was inherent in some of the statements that were made. But Bill, let me tell you something you may not be aware of, and that is that privately there were a number of Republicans who were urging the president not to use force out of a concern about what that might lead to. Now, when the moment of truth came, and the president asked the Congress to authorize the use of force, they were loyal to their party and supported him. But I have no doubt that if a Democrat had been in the White House, and if a Democrat had asked the Congress to approve the use of force, that there would have been many Republicans who supported a Republican president by the name of George Bush, who would have then voted against the resolution if there had been a Democrat incumbent in the White House, just as there probably would have been many more Democrats who would have supported the resolution if there had been a Democrat in the White House. Now, let me say that I think that kind of reaction, while perhaps understandable, is unfortunate, because on an issue of such moral and political magnitude, at a defining moment in history, with the vital interests of the country and perhaps the future, not just of the region, but of the world, hanging in the balance, I think decisions ought to be made not on the basis of partisan considerations, but on the basis of what's in the best interests of the country.
Well, you wouldn't expect me to disagree with you, would you? But there are those who say, you got to be a little careful, because after all, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution had only 2 senators who voted against it, and history vindicated them, the guy from Alaska and the other guy, and that there was, perhaps too much of a rush to get into this. Plus also, there's the idea of the loyal opposition, plus also there is whatever distinction you want to make between Iraq invading Kuwait and the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor. Those distinctions can justify certain democratic behavior. But I'm asking this, how can you persuade the intelligent voter that he is better off in the hands of a Democratic administration when the last major tests accosted by the Democrats showed this kind of insensitivity in terms of geopolitical intelligence and, as you put it, moral obligation? If they were so dumb this time around, what makes you think they're going to be bright next time around?
Well,
unless you're Secretary of State.
Well, I think that will happen, but I think it would depend, first of all, on which president, which Democrat, rather, is in the White House. Secondly...
but how's you going to get in the White House with your primary system, where the kooky left always sort of wins.
Well, I have an abiding faith in the intelligence of my fellow Democrats
You
and the
can't.
American people.
You can't possibly do that. Well, because if so, how can you do that retrospectively?
Well,
Did you have an abiding faith 4 years ago?
But
8 years ago? 12 years ago?
my faith isn't always justified, but I maintain it. And I think eventually we will prevail.
Eventually. In this century?
But, Bill, the answer, it's entirely possible. It's entirely possible. If Dan Quayle leads the ticket in 1996, certainly I think the prospects for the Democratic Party will be very encouraging. I wouldn't even preclude the possibility...
Isn't that negative campaigning that you despise?
No, it's simply a statement of reality, but
Quayle didn't do anything you disapprove of during the last crisis.
By the way, I like Dan Quayle personally, and I think he was very good on this crisis. But if you look at the polls, it suggests that he's not exactly the favorite even of his fellow Republicans.
Well, that's because you people have done a Willie Horton on him, haven't you?
Oh, I think that's a little bit unfair.
Is it?
To compare him to Willie Horton?
Well, I think it's extremely unfair, but I think that's what you've done.
Oh, no, I don't think so. But in any case...
I think a lot of people would think Willie Horton would make a better vice president than Quayle.
Oh, well, don't count me among them. But let me say, Bill, that to answer that question, that there are many other issues and problems that confront the country. And I would make the case for a Democratic administration on the grounds that the primary challenges confronting the country today lie here at home. And that in order to solve those problems, we're going to need an administration which believes that government is part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And that if we're going to make progress in providing a better education for our young people and rebuilding the infrastructure of the country and becoming more competitive internationally, if we're going to have a fairer and better America, that requires the kind of commitments which have been historically associated with the Democratic Party.
The kind of commitments which last time we had a Democratic administration gave us 21% interest rates and 13% inflation.
Well, I think
the last time Democrats were around, this is what happened.
I think that's about as relevant, Bill, as pointing to the depression that was brought to us by Herbert Hoover. That was part of ancient history. Let's look to the future rather than to the past.
What did Carter do domestically that you would now denounce?
That I would now
Denounce on the grounds that it gave us this antiquarian situation.
I'm reminded of what Dwight Eisenhower said
Give you a week?
when he was asked in 1960 what Nixon's major achievement was as vice president. He said, give me a week to think about it.
As you're telling us that Carter was so awful that we really shouldn't think of him anymore. We think of Hoover in the Depression, but you can't think what was awful about him.
No, I think he could have done a better job in dealing with.
Well, I think can you give me one piece of domestic legislation that you think you are prepared to denounce him for advocating?
Well, I generally supported his policies, and I can't.
So the answer is no, you can't.
Well, not off the top of my head, but you may enlighten me.
Well, maybe.
Did you? I certainly supported his efforts to get the Congress to approve a comprehensive energy policy. I think that was, very desirable.
Was that when we had to line up for gas, when you had your comprehensive energy policy?
Well, one of the reasons we had to line up for gas was that we had become increasingly dependent upon imported energy, and oil in particular. And we had to do something to insulate ourselves from that dependence. So I think in retrospect that people are coming to recognize that the kind of comprehensive approach to the energy problem which Carter was calling for made some sense.
I distrust the word comprehensive in situations like this. It seems to me that when it's better to use other sources of energy than oil, the market will gravitate in that direction. Now, coal, for instance, we don't... Sorry.
You don't really want to get into settling energy policy in this show. In any event, I don't think we can. Mr. Buckley, you amaze me with your Jesuitical defense of Phil Graham's accusations the Democrats are representatives of appeasement on the grounds that even if you don't really believe in appeasement, you weren't doing anything to throw outside on the same. For the entire post-war period, the Republican Party, among others, opposed launching an invasion of the Soviet Union. Now, would you say that someone who was truly an appeaser might also be against invading the Soviet Union? That made the Republicans the party of appeasement of the Soviet Union. It seems like a ridiculous argument.
Well, I can follow those steps formally put forward. But the reason the Republicans opposed invading the Soviet Union is the Soviet Union had nuclear bombs.
It was a prudential argument. Now,
we had to go back to Bertrand Russell to find somebody who actually invaded or proposed invading the Soviet
But
Union.
the point is,
But that was 1948.
the reason the Democrats, most Democrats, and I would say the majority of Democrats on this one side was smaller than the majority of Republicans on the other. But the reason these Democrats opposed force was prudential. Now, they may have been wrong about that, but it was not a principled belief in appeasement. That's the point.
Would you accuse President Bush and the Republicans right now of appeasement because the president, having encouraged the Iraqi people to revolt, now refuses to do anything to help them, in spite of the fact that Saddam is murdering tens of thousands?
That has nothing to do with appeasement. It has to do with a realpolitik, which I think has got serious in the way of the metaphysics of our entire foreign policy, because those metaphysics say that a point is reached at which the denial of humanitarian relief affects the whole geopolitical side of it, and I think we made a terrible mistake there.
So, Bill, I have to tell you that I am much more concerned about the failure of the administration now to make any kind of a real effort to come to the assistance of the Iraqi people, tens of thousands of whom are being slaughtered by Saddam and his forces, than I am about the failure of some of the Democrats to vote in favor of the use of force prior to January 15th.
Well, that's an interesting comparison, but the people who have most egged on, at least publicly in the journalistic world, are Bill Safire and Rosenthal, one Democrat and one Republican. I don't see that Bush has gotten into a lot of trouble from Democrats. We have to stop. Lucky for you. Welcome, Congressman Stephen Solarz. Ladies and gentlemen from the Harvard Republican Club. Those of them who aren't kept in the zoo, I suppose.
Funding for Firing Line was made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by L. John Plight, Jr., the Friends of Firing Line, and by the financial support